So have you been getting into growing semi-hydro for your plants or are thinking to get into it and want to know a bit more about what to look out for in terms of common problems that you might be facing? Stick around with me in this video and let's dive into it. Hi, my name is Memo, this is my channel Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me, it's tropical houseplants. So today I wanted to continue on the series that I started a while back, which is kind of giving you a bit more information about what my experiences have been growing in semi-hydro, in something like pon or semi-hydro mixes, and maybe kind of dive into some of the issues that you might come across and ones that I have come across and how I have dealt with them. But first, for the newbies here, let's discuss a bit more about what is semi-hydro, a bit more of a very brief introduction for semi-hydro. For the people that are kind of experts who have been doing this for a while, there should be chapters down below if you want to skip to the next topic. But for the newbies, welcome to what will invariably change the way you look at your houseplant care. So what is semi-hydro? So semi-hydro is hydroponic, would be growing plants exclusively in water. It's a very involved process. You might get it when certain like vegetables are grown hydroponically. Semi-hydro or passive hydroponics is something where you would have a reservoir of water at the bottom and then a medium or a growing material at the top that can absorb some of that water from down below. So it is passive in that respect. So it kind of happens naturally through capillary action, and that material that's kind of your growing material in the white part of this pot, and I will show you this pot a bit closer so you can understand, that's where you would have a water reservoir, which you can kind of put in. Apologies, mine's a bit dirty at the moment, but there is that element here where the media will be all the way down there. There are holes both at the bottom of this and on here, and essentially it would kind of wake up some of that moisture into whatever growing media, and the plant would be here basically. So that is semi-hydro or passive hydroponics. The other thing as well to remember is that within your water media, you need to add things like fertilizers, so nutrients that you might want to add into that water media, because you need to remember a lot of the times what you are using as your growing media is inert, and that just means unlike soil type mixtures, it doesn't have any of the minerals or kind of any of the materials or chemical elements that are needed by the plants in order to kind of help them better grow. So you need to find a decent semi-hydro or hydroponic fertilizer and use that within the water that you're providing the plant, because that's where it's going to be getting all of its nutrition from. So some of the benefits of growing semi-hydroponically is the fact that because you've got that water reservoir, think about if you're going away on holiday, as long as you've got a water reservoir ready and your plant is acclimated to having a water reservoir, and I'll get to acclimation in just a bit, you can kind of leave your plants for a bit longer without you having to hover around them because they have got that moisture reservoir at the bottom. I have also found one of the other benefits to be that I don't have to worry quite so much about the humidity, because if a plant needs high levels of humidity, but it's got moisture available to its roots at all times, like it would do with semi-hydro, unlike something like a soil mix where it might dry out before you've realized, and it's quite difficult to kind of always gauge that, a lot of the times you don't have to worry quite as much about providing the plant with high levels of humidity because it is getting enough of that moisture from its roots. The other thing as well that is quite good about growing semi-hydroponically is because a lot of the times you would use materials, and let me see if I can bring you some of the materials so you might be able to see. So for the people that have been doing this for a while, they know what I'm about to show basically. So you might have something like, this is a pon, or the commercial name for this from a company called Lechuza is pon, and it's just, think of it as baby gravels, which get everywhere. And then something like LECA, which is light expanded clay aggregate, I think. But think of it as just little clay pebbles, basically. And both of those materials, because they create a lot of air spaces between the roots of the plant, because that's what you would be growing plant in within the pot, it means there's a lot more air available to those roots. And if you might not know this already, roots need kind of air around them as well. A lot of the times what will lead to things like root rot is really boggy conditions where there isn't any air going to the roots. So this is allegedly a better way of growing than something like a soil media, because you're providing so much more air around the roots of your plant. And the thing I was talking about before, so using something like a fertilizer, you are in full control of the nutrition that your plant is getting, rather than having to rely on what's already in the soil if you're using a soil mixture. So some of the materials obviously commonly used, as I've mentioned, would be something like the kind of pon element of things. So I'll bring it in a bit closer so you might be able to see. It is just like little pebbles. Essentially what kind of pon mixtures or semihydro mixtures that are kind of looking like gravel tend to be is pumice, lava rock. I know before anybody says this, a lot of these other rocks are also lava rocks or rocks that originated. You know what I'm talking about, basically. So lava rock, pumice, and then zeolite is the other one as well. So sometimes you might also get some things in that look like really small pebbles of something, like really small beads. They tend to be slow release fertilizers. A lot of the pre-mixed ones that you might get in the market, I'm thinking more of the Lechuza, the brand that originally called this product Pon, will have that by default. I think they've got different versions that might not have it in there. I order most of mine these days from Soil Ninja, and they're very good at not putting the slow release fertilizers within their semi-hydro mixes. And I say it's a good thing because I can always buy those little beads of slow release fertilizer and add them in specifically when I want my plants to have access to them. But for plants that I do not want to have that within their root system or within their soil media, I do also then have the option, rather than me having to pick out all the ones that exist and maybe missing a few if I'm using something like the Lechuza Pon. So that is one. The other element is obviously, like I mentioned before, and again, I will bring it in a bit closer so you might be able to see, is something like LECA. And I'm trying to do this so I don't drop everything down. Hopefully it's not blowing out. But this is the clay aggregates. Now, people that have been here for a while know that I'm about to spill a whole bunch of LECA and Pon on the floor. But that has been a growing media that a lot of growers have been using for a long period of time. People that can remember this, I don't want to say as far as the 80s, definitely in the 90s, LECA was around and people were starting to use it. With the benefit with both of these media, they can be a bit more expensive because you need to buy them to use them if you don't have them. But you can also, if you find that you don't like it, you can also use them as amendments in soil mixes that you might do, because they will still offer kind of chunky elements within your soil and help with that kind of aeration in the soil as well. Now, the other thing that's worth noting for both of these materials is that you can reuse them all the time. So, and I know with soil mixes you can do the same thing, but in theory, if you want to be doing it properly and you're worried about passing kind of diseases or even pests around your plants, about reusing soil. So say I had something in soil and I removed that from its soil, but then I'm going to reuse that soil that I took out on a new plant. If there was any bugs in that or any pathogens that were in that, I'm going to then pass it on to the new plant. Yes, there are ways of sterilizing soil, but at the same time, you will also kill a lot of the beneficials that are in the soil. So a lot of people decide not to do that. With something like semi-hydro mixes, it is always a good idea, and this is why they're reusable, to sterilize them before you use them for other kind of growing conditions. Emma from Good Growing did a video recently. I think it might have even been a reel, and I will kind of add Emma's Instagram at the top. If you don't know Emma, you should definitely be following her as well. She's got an amazing channel on YouTube as well. And she was talking about the way she sterilizes her kind of semi-hydro mixes, which is kind of boiling them for X amount of time, letting them cool down, and then kind of moving them on. And that will sterilize them. You don't have the issue that you might have with soil mixes, where you're worried about killing off all some of the other beneficials. because this is, as I said in the beginning, an inert material, which means that there isn't much on there other than the actual material itself that you want to keep. So sterilizing with something like boiling is really, really good. The reality is, that's what I'm saying, go and see Emma's video because she is doing it the right way. Have I ever sterilized my materials? No, I flushed them. That's the other thing that you're going to need to remember is with something like either one of those materials, a lot of the times, if you're using a pot with like really big holes at the bottom, or you can use something like a colander if you've got it at home, you can put them in. You might want to use that exclusively for this, or be very careful to clean it out properly. But you can put all of this in, then run it under kind of as hot of water as you can possibly get to get most of that out. Let it air dry in a flat surface. And that is kind of doing something similar to sterilizing, if not perfectly. But it is kind of exposing things like if you are worried about kind of root rot kind of transferring to another plant that you're going to be reusing some of that material again, there's less of a chance of it happening if the actual substrate itself is fully air dried, because again, what causes root rot is the absence of kind of air, so it's anaerobic. So by exposing it to a lot of air and letting it air dry, you're basically killing it off, essentially. So there are other mediums that you could use as well, and I don't have any available to show you right now, but it's if you've ever used something like perlite in your soil mixes, and that's an easy way. If you've got a bag of perlite before you transition to these things, you can use just straight perlite and grow in that instead of LECA or instead of kind of pon to grow semi-hydroponically, because what you might then get is, okay, this is a good way of me experimenting without me having to buy, because some of these materials can be quite expensive if you're buying them for the first time, and you could do that. However, with the perlite side of things, it's very, very light, so you might get it floating and it's not quite as kind of heavy as pon. LECA is a bit lighter, so it's easier to deal with, but it's quite large chunks. So I usually will use these with things that have got bigger roots. This for something that has got slightly smaller roots or big roots, it's fine. But with perlite, you don't have to worry about that because it's as light as it is. It just, you might have a bit of a floating issue, basically. The other thing that you should be doing in an ideal world is if you're first getting any of these materials, whether it's perlite, pon, or LECA, you need to be washing it. By washing it, again, mentioning the colander that I was talking about before, or a pot that has got loads of holes in the bottom, you can put the material in and then run it quite a bit of time under some water. At least that's what I do. I know people can get very specific about the way that they wash their materials. That's what I've always done because I am inherently lazy and I've not had any issues. So if it ain't broke, I ain't fixing it. But yes, there are as many ways as you can possibly imagine to kind of wash your substrate, because a lot of these things, the LECA and the pon and the perlite, can be very, very dusty. I would also suggest potentially putting on something like a mask, because some of this might kick up a lot of this dust and you do not want that going into your lungs. So washing off all of that dust is the first thing that you would want to do before using any of this. And barring the fact that you want to get rid of the dust, the other reason why you would want to do this is if you don't get rid of that dust, initially what will then happen is, depending on how small some of the holes are at the bottom of your pot, especially if you're getting something that will have a way for the substrate to be touching the water reservoir, if it fills up with dust at the bottom, sometimes it can clog it up and then nothing is going through. So you definitely want to make sure that that loose dust is removed as much as possible. Okay, let's look at water and nutrient management in more detail. So remember we were talking about before about your reservoir. And I said when your plant is acclimated to the reservoir. And there's a kind of theory behind this is that if you've got your substrate in here, whether it's LECA or even something like pon, you would want to make sure that the plant, at least this is what I've done and I've had great success with, is you put your plant in, you transition your plant. I'll talk about transition in just a moment. You would water this. I wouldn't use the water reservoir. I would not keep a water reservoir straight away. And I would water this as I would a plant that was in soil. So I would water it thoroughly, make sure that all the water is coming up the bottom, empty the reservoir, put it back on. And that, for me, on average, needs about 2 to 3, possibly 4 months. So that plant has fully acclimated into whatever growing media you've got in there, whether it's pon or LECA or perlite or anything that you want to be using. And the roots have started growing in that media, and you're starting to see them going towards the bottom. At that point, you're going to start adding your reservoir. And that's the best way that I have found in terms of avoiding things like root rot during early days, and making sure that the plant has got enough time to acclimate. Because essentially, if a plant's always been grown in a soil media and you're trying to move it into this, it's a relatively big shock to its system. It needs to acclimate. However, you can get around that by, if you've got cuttings and you're going to be propagating them in water, water propagations can move straight into semihydro with a reservoir without a problem. Sometimes as well, if you're propagating in damp sphagnum moss, that will work. If you are propagating in a soil media, you'll have the same issue as if it was a plant that you just got and it's already in soil. You're going to need to transition that over. Now, on the topic of transition, one thing you do need to remember is that a lot of the times if you're getting something in kind of soil media, you're going to have to get rid of all of the soil, or as much of the soil as you can, from the roots. And I'm trying to look around to see if I can get a plant that has got an easy example that I can show you. Let me pick one up and I can show you. So if I bring up this plant here, and hopefully you might get some light, if not I will have to do this in editing, you might be able to see there's a root that's growing right there. And with this plant, if there was any soil on that root, that also could retain the moisture a bit too much, and it could potentially lead towards root rot. So I want to make sure that I'm removing as much of that soil as possible before moving the plants into semihydro. Now, there are some exceptions to this rule, and it would be things like ferns. So ferns, a lot of the times, if you've got them in a soil mix, you can then transition them into semihydro, but you would put the full plant with the soil mix in there. Possibly you might do this with some begonias as well, because some of these plants have got very thin hair-like roots. And if you try to remove all the soil, you will invariably get rid of all of the roots at the same time. So doing it that way, and maybe giving it even longer to transition from what I was talking about before, watering it as normal towards the reservoir. So maybe it's not 3 to 4 months, it might be 6 months to a year. It's a longer process, but your plants will thank you for it, because, for instance, something like ferns, I was a serial fern killer before I started using semihydro in this way that I've just mentioned. Now, specifically for something like ferns with the soil within it, I've pretty much been able to keep alive any of the ferns that I have brought into my collections using just this. So it is a bit of a game changer. The other thing that you need to remember with kind of water management with this is your fertilizer. And by that, I mean, you need to get a fertilizer. So I use liquid gold leaf in the UK. And the reason why I use it is because I can use it for both my soil plants and my semi-hydroponic plants without having to do any mixing. Otherwise, you can get like hydroponic fertilizers, and there's usually, I'm thinking about the general hydroponics fertilizer, and there's usually one that's for blooms or for foliage, and then there's a micronutrients, and then you need to mix them up in certain kind of percentages to be for the bloom, and then to be for the foliage, and to be for the micronutrients. But if you mix them all a bit too early, you might get something called what's it called? It's called nutrient lockout, because you've mixed it in the wrong order or in the wrong way. And then even though it seems fine, it's doing nothing because those nutrients are locked away and your plant can't get to them because they've attached to themselves instead of becoming available to the plant and the roots. Massively convoluted thing. If you really love the scientific thing and you want to play mad scientist and mad chemist and do all the mixings and you want to do all these things, hydroponics are going to be your jam, because you're going to love kind of going into this. And I would actually say, don't use something like this. Use something that you mix yourself, because you can get your mad scientist on like nobody's business. But for the majority of people who really don't want to faff, find a good fertilizer, even one that doesn't necessarily, you can then end up buying a separate one. I like liquid gold leaf because I can do both. And I know Kaylee Ellen's got her fertilizer that will do both. But if you can get one that will do both, then you've only got one fertilizer, you only buy one thing for all of your plants. If you cannot find it where you are, you should be able to find a decent fertilizer for the plants that are in soil. I'm sure there's something there. And you might be able to find a semi-hydro fertilizer that's already pre-mixed, so you don't have to do any of the mixing yourself. So in that situation, you might have to buy 2 separate ones. As I said, this works for me because it's got both of them combined. But yeah, and I really cannot be bothered with the nutrient lockout that could potentially happen. The other thing as well, and I've not done this, and I probably should do this, is you should be pH testing your water. And you can get pH testing kits and all these things. That's what I'm saying. This is an involved process. If you want to do it properly, and even I'm not doing it fully properly, as I said, I'm not pH testing the water. But by pH testing the water, some of the nutritional elements, when you're mixing them, they need to have a certain pH in order for them to work. But also, your plants, specific plants prefer specific pHs. I'll give you an example when it comes to things in your garden, for instance. So say you've got something like a hydrangea. And if you've ever grown a hydrangea in the garden, they can be pink blooms or they can be blue blooms. And that is to do with the acidity of the soil. So a lot of the times they say if you want to have blue blooms, then you would add an element into the soil to make it more acidic so you can get those blue blooms. Some plants do better in more acidic soils. And the same thing you need to bear in mind within your mixture as well. So for instance, there's all of these things to consider. So if it's too acidic, will the fertilizer work? If it's too alkaline, will the fertilizer work? But where does a plant need the acidity level to be? And these are things that you can dive into in insane amounts of detail, but it could lead to some of the problems that we're just going to look at a bit further down in this video. So let's have a look at some of the issues. First issue, and possibly the most predominant one that you're probably going to have to deal with at some point or another, ironically enough, mentioning what I mentioned earlier on about avoiding root rot because you've got so much aeration, you also constantly got water around them. And if you're waterlogging these plants, there's still a risk of root rot. So I'll bring you in and I'll show you this specific plant, and you might be able to see some of the darker roots. That's the first point I was going to make when you're kind of assessing what the issue might be. You also need to be aware of what your plant roots look like. So for instance, with this specific Syngonium, the roots are actually quite dark on their own. So the fact that I'm seeing dark roots within their clear pots, which is the other point I'm trying to make, is always have something like a clear pot if at all possible, especially if you're first starting off, because you can quickly see the signs of something like root rot and potentially pests as well, that you might get some pests that are growing within the roots. You can then kind of judge accordingly, because for instance, if you've got some root rot, the roots will look darker. Now, if your plant's got dark roots anyway, you need to be aware of that so that you don't think, oh no, it's instantly got root rot. No, it just might be the roots themselves. So the other thing that you might want to do is, for all, however weird it might seem, sniff your plant's roots if at all possible, basically. And if you are getting a slightly kind of decaying smell from that, if not slightly, but very decaying smell, you probably do have root rot. And then you need to do a few things. So at that point, what you would want to do if you've got root rot, several things that you need to address. Firstly, that water reservoir water needs to be chucked out, and the entire cache pot or the decorative pot that might have, or in this pot where the reservoir is, that green bit at the bottom, they need to be cleaned out, scrubbed down, and if at all possible, sanitized, and then let to air dry. Because remember what we said about root rot before, it is anaerobic. So it doesn't like being exposed to oxygen or to the air, basically. So first thing you would do is clear that out and clean it and sanitize it. The next thing you would do, unfortunately, is you'd need to remove the plant in its entirety with its roots that are still, hopefully some of them going to be viable, out of whatever growing media you've got. And at that point, what you would want to do is make sure that you're cutting off all of the rotted elements of that root, possibly a bit higher. So say, for instance, let me give you an example. Say, for instance, This janky support stick is one of the roots, and you see that there's root rot. There we go. Hopefully the color difference might come up there. This is a bit darker. That's where the root rot is. I would cut the root a considerable amount higher than where you're visibly seeing the root rot. This might be healthy. This is diseased looking down here. And the reason for that is sometimes the rot is moved further up, but it's inside and it hasn't started showing on the outside. So that's why you'd want to get rid of it. And I will answer this question before anybody asks it, because I've had this in the past. Somebody's just like, but that means I'm going to get rid of the entire root because it's got the smallest amount of like healthy root at the top. Welcome to the realities of root rot. It is that. But yeah, like you'd need to go higher than that, basically. So that's the thing that you need to do. And at that point, you would want to let that air dry again, even after you've cut it, just to make sure if there's any other root rot anywhere on the roots of that plant. I know some people use hydrogen peroxide. I find just letting the plant's roots dry out as much as I possibly can before putting it again into a different media works like a charm. Different media is the other thing that you heard me say there, because what you don't want to be doing is just removing it out of this, say, pond that I've got in here, letting it dry out and putting it back into the same pond. No. At that point, consider that pond non-usable for a moment. You need to find new pond or new material that you want to grow it in. Again, make sure that you're rinsing all of that dust off. It might be a good idea to pre-rinse a lot of your materials so you've got them ready to go, so you don't have to do it every time. You might still need to do a quick rinse, but you can do that within the pot potentially, and then put it in that medium. Now, what you're going to be doing with the media that you've just removed this plant from is what I was talking about in terms of sterilizing. You're going to have to sterilize at that point. And I don't want to go as far as say, get rid of that material because it's quite expensive to potentially buy, but you can sterilize it. As I said, you can check out Emma's reel and she goes into more detail into how she does it. But you would want to make sure that that substrate that it was growing in is as sterile as possible, because if you then move it directly, either the same plant into it, it might reinfect, or if you move a different plant into it quite soon after, it could then also infect that plant as well. So bear that in mind, that you would need to do this. And then I would take it a step further and take a step back and reevaluate why that happened with that plant. Is it because, like for instance, this pot here doesn't have any extra air holes within where the substrate would be, and it's kind of like a closed system. So it just made the situation worse. At that point, you might want to consider doing something like what I've got here, and having a clear pot again, which you can see, and then maybe cutting in or creating some holes within that pot so that you can make sure that it's getting as much air as possible. Another option that you could use if you don't want to sit there and deal with like the popping the holes in, this is a bad example because these kind of holes are way too big, but you can get net pots, and you can get some net pots. I don't have any currently that have got much smaller holes, and that will by default mean that it's getting a lot of air going through it. So the final point that I want to make with this is evaluate why it happened and make sure that you adjust. Did you transition it to a reservoir too quickly? Did the reservoir's water not get kind of checked often enough? Is there an issue happening with your fertilizer? Is there not enough air going in because it's closed vessels? Any of these things could be causing it, and the step back that I'm talking about is going to teach you what went wrong with that. So potentially it kind of becomes ingrained. We all learn faster from our mistakes than we do our wins, ironically enough. It means that inherently when you're doing things to your other plants that are in semi-hydro, you won't make the same mistakes. I'm not going to lie, you're probably going to lose a few plants in the process, but it's all part of the journey. We've all lost plants. I do not want to tell you quite how many plants I've killed in both semi-hydro and in soil. But as you might be able to see around my entire space, I have a few plants basically. So I kind of talk from a place of experience, if not expertise at least. I definitely talk from a place of experience. The next thing that you're probably going to deal with, and it's kind of a common issue with semi-hydro, is something like algae. And hopefully this might be bright enough for you to be able to see. Anything that you can't see brightly enough, I will see if I can add videos or images. This entire pot is covered in algae. Now, what that generally means is, and I can tell you exactly why this happened with this plant, and this, by the way, is one of my Anthurium forgetii. It's on the two-leaf club at the moment, but it's doing okay. Is that with the algae, think about how algae kind of occurs and what it needs in order to thrive. It needs light. So in those situations, and let me put this down and I'll show you how you get around it, is make sure that if you're using something like a clear pot, which means that the algae can be exposed to light, that you're putting it into an opaque container. It might mean that in order for you to see what's going on in your pot, you're going to need to take it out every so often, but it then means that you don't get any algae buildup because no light is going to the inside of the pot, basically, or minimal light is going there. So there is that. Now, the question that a lot of people usually ask is algae a problem? This is a heavy question that I don't know if I can answer for you truly. I've had plants that have had algae around their roots, especially in Semihydro, for years, and it's not caused them any issues, basically. I've had other plants where the algae became so dense that even when I had the holes in the pots, so again, I'll bring it in so you can see the holes in the pots, they covered those holes, and essentially it almost created that closed vessel that causes issues with root rot. So my suggestion with this would be, if you can avoid getting the algae in the first place, avoid getting the algae in the first place. If you do get the algae and you're worried about having to repot your plant, it might not be that much of an issue. Judge it by how the plant is reacting to it and just keep a beady eye on the algae. The other thing that some people have done, and I've done as well, is sometimes when you've got plants with algae that's coming on the outside, you then put a cash po in, the algae could potentially start dying off slowly. And then you do really need to keep a beady eye, because essentially what you might get is rotting material from the algae, which could potentially later on, at least in my head, lead to potential root rot problems. So a lot of things to consider there, but I think prevention in this situation is better than fixing. So if you can avoid it altogether by having it in an opaque pot, so ideal case scenario is what I've got here, is a clear pot within a non-clear pot, fine. And that pot can also be where I would have the reservoir. It's challenging because in this situation, the reservoir is within this pot, so I can't see what the water level is. But after you've done it for a while, you'll kind of have an indication as to where your water is. The final thing I want to touch on is things like nutrient deficiencies or toxicities. And this is where your management of your fertilizer and your water reservoirs is really going to come into play. Because essentially what you need to remember is, if something, remember what we talked about the pH before, the pH might be what's blocking it. If it's too high or too low in pH, it might be blocking the plant from actually absorbing the nutrients. The other thing that I was mentioning earlier on about mixing your own version of a hydroponic fertilizer is, if you've done it in the wrong way and you haven't realized, and you've done the nutrient lockout, which, as I said, essentially, if I'm understanding it correctly from when I was looking into it, it means that those nutrient elements are no longer available to your plants. If you've had nutrient lockout, you might as well just be sitting your plant in straight water without any nutrient solution. It's not available to this plant at that point. You might have a deficiency at that point. Do you see what I mean? So if it's too high or too low of a pH and the plant can't absorb it, it might as well not be there. If you've had nutrient lockout, it might as well not be there. It might as well just have pure water, and you're just like, but I'm doing everything right. Why is this not working? It could be one of those two reasons, basically. The other thing is something like plant toxicities, basically, is when you've maybe over-fertilized. So the one thing that you should always try, if at all possible, whatever your growing media is in Semihydro, to do is every month, every 2 months, depending on how heavily you're fertilizing your plants, instead of using and filling it up and watering it with your standard nutrient solution, put a reminder somewhere, and at that point, flush it with just clean running water, fill up the reservoir for a bit with just clean running water, and essentially any of the nutrients that are not being used, that are staying within the growing media or within the cache pot or the container or the reservoir of water, at that point are flushed out. And it then means that the plant has a chance of bouncing back. And nutrient toxicities or nutrient deficiencies can come up, and you can usually see them in the leaves. Don't think crisping of the leaves. Think more along the lines of if you've got leaves that are coming out deformed, or if the leaves are getting smaller and it's not because they're not being supported. Things like that is when you really need to start looking at, is my plant getting the nutrition that it needs, and is it getting it at the right level? Has it got some toxicities there? These are all things that you need to be considering. The other element might be that you're maybe fertilizing your plant too much, too heavily. Potentially you're giving too much fertilizer in that water solution for that specific plant. And it might be getting too much or too little as well. So again, that's something you need to adjust for. Not all plants are going to need the same amount of nutrition going into their nutrient solution. So that's a good thing to remember there as well. The other thing to remember when you're doing your water and creating that solution with the nutrient is, especially when you're looking at things like pH, what water you're using is going to be different. Because let me give you a very specific scenario. Say, for instance, for the longest period of time, you've been watering your plants semi-hydroponically, and you're using distilled water, and you're mixing all of your solutions with that, and you're watering your plants. And at some point, you just go, you know what, I can't be bothered with distilled water. It's too expensive, or I don't want to be doing that anymore, and I'm just going to use tap water. And because you know your solution ratio, you're just like, I'm just going to do what I've always been doing. No, so the pH, if you're using your nutrient solution in distilled water, or even reverse osmosis water, or rainwater, or tap water, is going to be drastically potentially different because of those different elements that might already be in those different versions of water, basically. So it's always a good idea at that point, if you're changing your water that the solution is going in, to do a new pH test and see if there's enough of a difference that will mean that you're going to need to adjust the nutrients again. So in terms of kind of my final thoughts, Semihydro is a very strong way of kind of growing plants. And again, I will show you around some of my space, and you might be able to briefly see some of my plants are in soil. Some of them that you might be able to see behind me are also in Semihydro mixes, and they're all growing particularly well, some better than others, basically, depending on their kind of growing conditions. What I have found is that a lot of plants that maybe grow near running water, so think alocasias, colocaceas, things like that, can do exceptionally well in something like Semihydro, because it means they've always got water available to them, but they've also got the aeration to the soil, or to the growing media. In this case, it's not soil, it will be Semihydro mix. And so that is a bit that you need to remember, is that some plants will do well, some plants won't. Some plants will have a longer transition period, some other plants won't. Keep an eye out for things like root rot, and adjust everything and step back and realize what went wrong. Make sure that when you're moving your plant over, you're changing your habits so it doesn't happen again. Try to address what it is and then apply it to the rest of your plants, because if it happened once, it could happen to some of your others as well. Making sure that you're at least monitoring your nutrient solution on a semi-regular basis. It doesn't have to be every time, but just so you've got an understanding of, is there going to be a nutrient deficiency that's going to happen? Know a bit more about your plants and maybe what pH you might be comfortable with. Make sure that you're washing your materials first before you use them for the first time, and in an ideal world, sanitizing them between uses with different other plants. Making sure that you remove as much of the soil on some plants before transitioning them into Semihydro. Having a period where you're watering the plant in Semihydro without a reservoir before you transition over to a reservoir. And keep a beady eye out for things like algae. But a lot of these things might seem like a lot. So if you're just beginning, hopefully this hasn't scared you off. If you're going to get into the geeky element of all this, run with it and enjoy, because there are so many different parameters and elements, and it depends on how involved you want to be with it. I am semi-demi involved with the process of like my Semihydro. So could my Semihydro plants be doing better? Yes. Could they also be doing worse if I was doing even less? Probably yes. So it depends on where your comfort level is going to be, but don't let this scare you off. I have done other videos, and I'll try to link them throughout the video or in this section, on me talking about the Semihydro, maybe at a more basic level, and hopefully that might help you if you're starting off. But for the people that have been there for a while and you're still trying to get to grips with some of these things, hopefully this video has been useful. If you've got some of your own tips about how you're growing in Semihydro and some of the challenges that you faced and how you overcame those, do drop them in the comments down below. I'm sure both myself and a lot of the other people watching this would be keen to see. And yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon. And I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.